Senator Mackenzie. Senator Fawcett.
Thank you, Mr President. I rise to make a few comments tonight about the topic of terror and how it affects our societies and how it's reported in the media. Clearly in Parramatta recently, Australia has had its attention focused on the murder of Curtis Cheng, and there's been a deal of discussion subsequent to that about how such a young person, in fact in the network now we're seeing people as young as 12 possibly who are caught up in that, and the questions are how can such a young person be so quickly radicalised to the point where they can enact that kind of violence and devastate an innocent family of a man going about his work, who'd been contributing to Australia, and as others have pointed out, probably representing the best about multicultural Australia, a person who'd come from a completely different culture who was contributing to Australia in a very positive way. I go to the speech by Prime Minister Cameron in England earlier this year because I think it provides very useful discussion around this topic. And to quote him, he says, "You don't have to support violence to subscribe to certain intolerant ideas which create a climate in which extremists can flourish." And he goes on to say, "Some argue it's because of historic injustices and recent wars, because of poverty and hardship. This is an argument which I call the grievance justification, which must be challenged." Well, Mr President, it's not only in Australia that we see grievances and subscribing to intolerant ideas that create this environment where young people cause incredible harm and damage. In Israel at the moment, we see nightly reporting almost of the violence that is occurring there, but most of the reporting appears to be about the Palestinians who are shot or injured or arrested by the Israeli police. And I think it's really important to get a balance to that, and I condemn the violence from both sides, but it's important to see where is the incitement for this particular round of violence coming from. And what do I mean by the violence? Well, to quickly summarise, in Tuesday morning in Jerusalem, 2 men boarded a bus and stabbed and shot Israeli citizens. They killed 2, wounded 16. At the same time, across another part of town, a Palestinian man drove his vehicle into a bus stop, got out of the car and started to attack the wounded people with a meat cleaver. 2 additional stabbings took place at a bus stop and a cafe, and that was just on Tuesday. And earlier in the month, a couple driving through the West Bank were shot and killed in front of their 4 children. On the Sunday, a police officer and a woman were injured when people tried to detonate explosives in their car. So multiple attacks on people, security forces responding to that. There's been death and violence on both sides, but it's important that when the media are reporting this and we're discussing it, that we keep a balance on cause and effect, and clearly the security forces are reacting. There'll be lots of arguments about the long-term stability between those 2 groups of people. But in this particular case, much of the upsurge in violence stems back to a speech given by Mr Abbas at the United Nations, where he made the claim that Israel was changing the long-held status quo about access to the Mount and the Al-Aqsa Mosque. And as a result, lots of people have been motivated, have been incited to take action to, in their view, protect the mosque. Now, despite the Israeli government making repeated assurances and statements that that was not the case, that nothing had changed, just that statement at the United Nations has unleashed, it appears, this new wave of violence. And it is so important as we grapple with things here in Australia that we recognise that there are strongly held views on the side of different groups in our society, but we must be free to talk about the facts, we must be free to talk about the causes, and people need to realise that you don't need to actually advocate the violence to create the environment within which some people can very quickly go to being interested in, to being adherents of worldviews and ideas that are intolerant, and again, as Prime Minister Cameron said, ideas which are hostile to basic liberal values such as democracy or freedom or sexual equality, that actively promote discrimination, sectarianism or segregation. Because it's those kinds of ideas that can then very rapidly enable people to be radicalised from an extreme view to enacting violence as a result of that extreme view. So here in Australia we need to be aware of that. We need to have the kind of freedom of speech that Senator Day in his bill earlier today was seeking to highlight the need for, that we shouldn't be dampening people's ability to have that free speech. And I support Senator Day in his bill which looks to remove the subjective tests of infend or assault from Section 18C of the Racial Discrimination Act. I believe it's important that our media is accurate, and I believe it's important as we look at events around the world, whether it's terror, that we report accurately the casualties on both sides. And I guess the last thing I'd like to say, Mr. President, in a society where we do value life, we value the life of individuals, particularly of young people, I condemn the violence that has taken the lives of so many innocents, young people, as well as men and women going about their daily lives, and call on all parties involved on that to have restraint, and particularly in this case for President Abbas to not continue to put forward the view that a very sacred object for that community is under any kind of threat, when clearly the facts are that it's not, and there's been repeated and insistent statements that it's not. It's an issue that we don't need to be seeing inciting more violence when there's enough long-term issues in that part of the world that need to be resolved.
Thank you.